Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your snow day. I know I did. Got some naps in. Um, so, because our class only meets once a week, the snow day, missing 1 week from a snow day, is really going to throw off our schedule. So, what I'm going to do, rather than give you an extra paper or reading or anything, is I'm just going to do a video kind of lecture um, to catch you up on the material and to hopefully make up for a little bit of lost time. I also want to revisit a couple of the things that we talked about but didn't really fully flesh out. Alright, so I'm just going to dive in. We already looked at this Murat Oppenheim object, or luncheon in fur. Um, we were talking about it in the context of form versus function. So what I want you to do is really start off when you see an object, whether it's on the midterm or in real life, and just describe its content. Sorry, that's the bell. I'm at school right now, but just describe what it looks like, what it actually is. So you would describe this as a teacup, a saucer, and a spoon, all covered in some type of animal fur. Um, it's very kind of visceral to us. We wouldn't want to drink out of it. It's yeah, we just have that reaction to it, and it's something that's completely strange that we wouldn't normally see. Now, in terms of function, this a functional cup? I mean, yes, maybe it would hold liquid, but like we said, we would not drink out of it. So that kind of function is function. How does it affect us in that visceral kind of way? So that is all content, things that we can kind of extrapolate from the object itself or the painting. Now, after we get the content in there, we're going to move over to context. And that context is basically the conditions in which the object was made. So things like the time frame in which it was made, or what other trends were happening in the art world around the time that it was made. So for this one, object, the story, as we discussed, was one day Oppenheim was at a cafe with both Pablo Picasso and Dora Maar, M-A-A-R, who are both fellow artists. Oppenheim was wearing a brass bracelet covered in fur when Picasso and Maar, who were admiring it, proclaimed almost anything can be covered in fur. As Oppenheim's tea grew cold, she jokingly asked the waiter for another with more fur. Surrealism was very interested in the unconscious mind, taking a lot of its cues from Sigmund Freud, and the ideas of the unconscious. And therefore, surrealist artists loved these happenstance moments and used these moments, such as Picasso and Maar's comment, as a way to kind of circumvent conscious choice in their art making. And that was a huge shift from the artist as genius idea, where artists were always the source of their own ideas and enacted them through their work. This kind of was a way for artists to give the power to just happenstance moments. So surrealism really started to define notions of how artists had to make art. So when this work was displayed, surrealist writer André Breton assigned object a different title, and that title is what you see here as Luncheon in Fur. So the title is a play on two 19th century works, Edouard Manet's infamous modern painting Luncheon on the Grass and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's erotic novel Venus in Furs. With these two references, Breton kind of forces an explicit sexualized meaning onto object because of those references. And if you recall, the original intent for dressing the utensils in fur was purely practical as a means to keep the tea warm, if you will. And so thinking about how has the title Luncheon in Fur changed how this work is viewed, and what are the ethics of renaming this object in a way that the artist did not intend? So, just things to think about. So moving on, we got to realism versus abstraction. Realism is a really tough word to use when describing art because we use realism to talk about things that look real, right? Things that look like they would in real life. But artists such as Mark Rothko, as you see here with his paintings, they're not of any object. They're not representing any physical thing, which is why we call them non-representational. But he would argue that his painting is just as much as real as any other painting or piece of artwork. And that it's about emotion and it's about experience, and that's just as real as, say, an object or a person or anything like that. So instead of using the term realism when we describe things that look like they would in real life, we use the term naturalism to describe how things look in the natural world. Now, representational versus non-representational is just, is it representing a identifiable object or thing, or is it just completely abstracted? So that is another differentiation that you can make when doing your formal analysis of the work. So the questions to ask are, does it look like it would in real life? Have things changed? And is it simplified? And how is it simplified, or how is it changed? And how abstracted is it? So abstraction happens on a kind of spectrum. It's not just it's abstract or it's naturalistic. There are some in-betweens there that kind of combine the two. So describing those is really important to understanding the work. Moving on to Chuck Close, we talked about him a little bit. And his work is considered photorealism. This is one of the few kind of areas that we actually use the term realism or realistic. Is when we talk about the images, such as the big self-portrait on the left, that look like a photograph. It's photorealistic. It looks like exactly how it does in real life. So very, very naturalistic. Whereas the self-portrait on the right, it's not as realistic or as photorealistic. And it's not as naturalistic. There's a degree of abstraction that happens. You can see that he's working in a grid, and he plays a game with himself. He kind of compares it to a golf course, is that every one of those grids, he wants to get the color within that grid right, within 4 strokes. So like a par 3 course or whatever it is. I'm not very familiar with golf, but sometimes he would make it in 1 or 2, and maybe he would get that and he would call it an eagle or whatever it would be in golf. But that idea of kind of assigning rules to what you are doing and kind of making the act of making it becoming a game is something that artists do often to get kind of interesting results that they were kind of really going for in the first place. Now, a little bit of the background for Chuck Close is he was born with prosopagnosia. So prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia is an inability to recognize and remember faces. It's also called face blindness. And prosopagnosia usually has to do with depth perception of the features of the face. So the distance of the nose to the cheeks, to the eyes, to the ears, to the lips. Those kind of depth relationships don't register in his brain. So by almost obsessively recreating portraits, self-portraits or portraits of other people, he is kind of asserting that kind of three-dimensional representation of these people on a flat plane to kind of remember those faces. And he was also dyslexic. But In 1988, he suffered a seizure from a spinal artery collapse that left him paralyzed. After the seizure, he began making work with a paintbrush strapped to his wrist. And the example on the right, the self-portrait, is an example of that. He couldn't get those fine details of every strand of hair in that mustache like he did on the left anymore. So it was more kind of capturing the essence of the portrait or the general idea. And by making these kind of swaths of shapes of paint. And the fact that he was still able to create a portrait that is representational of that person is really incredible to me. So in terms of naturalism versus abstraction, and representational versus non-representational, think about it. Which one of these is abstracted? The self-portrait on the right is much more abstracted. It departs from naturalism in that we don't have those colors in our face. We don't have those grid lines on our face or bodies. But it's still representational in that it's recognizable as a portrait. On the left, the big self-portrait, it is very naturalistic, and at the same time is very representational. It's photorealism, so that's kind of how that works. Going on, this is kind of more of an example of the games that he would play with color, and he was a master of color theory. And these little grids that he would use to create this tone. We don't have these blue tones, like right here, in our skin, but by putting small amounts of those tones in the skin and then backing up from it, we get a sense of the shadows underlying the skin and the kind of pallidness of that skin. So it's kind of a game that he would play with that. Especially looking this close to it, you see just how abstract it is. It's barely recognizable that this is part of a face, but when you back up, it gets a little bit more towards that naturalism that we understand that it's a portrait. We understand that it's a person, it's a man, and we can describe what he's wearing and how he looks. This idea of the grid, it's useful to think of it as pixels on a screen. The more you zoom in to pixels, they become just little blocks of color with subtle nuances between them. But the further that you go out, they combine visually to make a subtly gradated color so that it makes sense visually to us and becomes more and more naturalistic. Now moving on, Philip Glass was one of his favorite subjects. So Philip Glass is an experimental minimalist composer who was largely shunned by fellow composers in performance spaces at the time. And because he was shunned, he began performing in art galleries, and after befriending contemporary artists of the time in New York, such as Chuck Close and Sol LeWitt. This kind of reductive, theoretical approach to music that he was known for, even though it wasn't celebrated in music right away, the artists of the time, the minimalists, really latched onto it. So you get the sense of these kind of theoretical ideas in the creative world kind of cross-pollinating between media, whether it's music or dance or painting or sculpture. And these ideas kind of change. And then you also see his interest in media change. From the photorealistic acrylic paint on canvas in 1969 to watercolor and acrylic mixed with the grid that he was using, to 1980, getting rid of paint altogether and the brush and using fingerprinted stamp ink. So putting his fingers on the pad and just building up those tones with his fingerprints. And then in 2001, turning to photography with the daguerreotype, which is one of the first photographic processes that was used back in the 1840s. So it's interesting to see how kind of his work has progressed over the time, especially with the same person. Now, kind of going a little bit more into naturalism versus abstraction, we look at Ralph Goings and Robert Joyner, similar images of ketchup bottles. Ralph Goings was interested in kind of these diner scenes of how things were arranged in terms of still life. Now, this is what we call still life, inanimate objects depicted. So, Ralph Goings was really interested in the kind of classic Americana, and how waiters and waitresses would just arrange certain things on the table the same way at every table, and it was kind of arbitrary how they did it, but it was consistent. So he recreated them in a very intensely naturalistic, photorealistic way, in order to just, present it to us in that way, almost aggrandize them and make them look a lot more important than they are. I mean, they're just ketchup bottles in probably a rundown diner on the side of the road. But the light shining off of them and the way that they're composed, they're much more expressive in terms of the light. And then we have Robert Joyner over here, who uses this messy, free, gestural way to paint the ketchup bottle. And we all kind of have that idea or that memory as a kid of biting into a hot dog and then a giant glob of ketchup dropping onto our shirt. Excuse me. All right. A giant glob of ketchup or mustard falling onto your shirt or pants. And that messiness and that kind of experience is what he was going for with this. That kind of...
Riley, report to room 217.
Sorry. All right. So that's what he was trying to get at. That kind of messy, free, gestural nature of ketchup and how we experience it. And then the title, Ketchup and Mustard. Obviously, we understand the ketchup, but the yellow background that he chose is representative of that mustard. That kind of messiness that goes into each other and everything like that. And also thinking about how these artists apply the paint. So Ralph Goings on the left has a very fine application of the paint. It doesn't look like paint at all. It looks like a photograph. Whereas Robert Joyner, it looks very much like thickly applied paint without much care as to how thick it is or thin it is in certain areas. We have a splash of yellow right here, like the mustard would splash across the ketchup. And also thinking about space in terms of naturalism versus abstraction. How does space function? In the Goings, there's a clear organization of space. They're on a counter. There's a wall behind it. There's light coming from this side, casting a shadow. Whereas in this one, the Robert Joyner, there isn't even a continuation of paint on the edges of the paper. He completely leaves it open. So there is no illusion of space or kind of an articulation of space within that painting. Going on to Thomas Cole and Paul Cézanne. So this would be a landscape representation of naturalism versus abstraction. So Thomas Cole has highly rendered naturalistic and very detailed depiction of a space. And the three-dimensional space is clear. In the foreground, we have a deer jumping across the river, and then behind it there's like a little valley or a stream that goes by, then kind of like this little plateau with people hunting on it. And then it goes back to this space back here where there's canoes in the water, and then back to this kind of little village of teepees, and then all the way back to the ocean and like this little mountain. There's a clear representation of space starting in the foreground and receding very far into the background. Whereas Paul Cézanne, the representation of space is there, but it's not as articulated. Everything kind of has the same tonality in this whole area. But we have a mountain that's pretty recognizable as a mountain going back. But in terms of space, there is no kind of representation of that space. Um, Over in the Thomas Cole, you notice that the foreground is much darker and has much higher contrast, whereas the further you go back, it gets more and more flat. And that kind of atmosphere that he creates really depicts that space even more. Whereas in the Palais Cézanne, we don't really get as much of that. So the Cézanne is just the blocky colors and an impasto application. So impasto, I-M-P-A-S-T-O, is that thick application of paint that really feels like paint. Whereas over here in Thomas Cole, it's a fine application. It's not obviously paint. But over here in Cézanne, you get the sense that he's just globbing paint on there in different kind of almost like violent marks, just like throwing it onto the canvas. So line, form, and shape are really what matters in the Cézanne, where in Thomas Cole, everything is just highly rendered. And in the Cézanne, there are no figures, it's just a landscape. We have the sense that this might be a structure here, but it could also just be more of like a field going back here. So it's definitely more abstracted, though both of them are representational. So going on, we're going to continue with this series by Thomas Cole. He created an entire series of work in response to the Industrial Revolution that was happening at the time, and the idea that industry had to keep on producing, and we became more of a industrial society rather than an agrarian society focused on farmers and crops. So we start he starts with his love of the natural, kind of what he called a blasted landscape. And what he calls the blasted landscape is basically the final frontier of America. He viewed America as the final frontier because it was the last kind of space on Earth that wasn't touched or tainted or anything like that by civilization. Whereas all throughout Europe you have influence of Greece and Rome and all of these kind of influences that shape the landscape and kind of have left their mark. Whereas America is the kind of final frontier of the blasted landscape. And it really was a push against the industrialism of the time. And it was a lot about the immutability of Earth, or the inability of Earth to be changed, versus kind of the transience of man, the kind of cycle of death, whereas Earth is resilient. So we'll start here with the savage state. So the savage state is really talking about nomadic life. There are no structures. There is no sense of like organized civilization. The hunter over here, it's a very hunter-gatherer society, where the hunter over here is wearing deerskin clothing, and it's raw, untouched nature. The people are traveling in kind of primitive canoes, and you get the sense that this is depicting kind of Native American life before colonialism came into the U.S. The settlement is right by the water, as many settlements have been historically, because water is a source of life. And this rock in the background kind of takes a prominent position, this kind of outcropping with this kind of rock. And the reason he does this, as we'll see soon on, is to provide a reference that this is the same space that he is predicting over and over in this series of works. And this is also very much about kind of man versus God, or the sublime, in terms of the creation of Earth and kind of that wildness and that untouchedness of Earth. So, we'll move on to the Arcadian state. In the Arcadian state, wilderness has kind of given way to settled lands, in a sense that we now have a temple back here that seems relatively permanent, kind of that monolithic temple evocative of Stonehenge, or early classical periods of Rome and Greece. We have a bridge to get over water rather than jumping over water or using rocks to get over water. The figures in the foreground, like this old man and this child, are thought to be practicing. This man is drawing in the sand, and he's thought to be the start of kind of math and intellect and art and written language. And the clothing is now weaved clothing rather than deerskin. We have a herd of sheep rather than kind of a hunter-gatherer society. We have people over here plowing the earth and farming the earth rather than gathering plants from what is natural. So we get a sense that that kind of society before, where it was very nomadic, has started settling down and creating civilization. And also notice, as we go back, this rock is here. What he's trying to do is depict that same space and let you know that this is the same space over the period of time developing. Moving on, the consummation from the course of empire. So this is very much evocative of Greece or Rome. What's happening here seems to be a coronation of a king or some sort of parade or party of a victorious general. The megalithic temple that we saw in the last one, the Arcadian state, is now blossomed into an entire kind of classical arcade of architecture. Now, instead of canoes and kind of primitive boats, we have these kind of elaborate ships with these huge sails and ornate decoration. We have decorations such as like in the lions for fountain and this massive kind of decorative fountain. You get the sense of kind of luxury and exuberance from this, and this kind of represents the height of Greece or Rome or a civilization such as that. Now moving on, we have destruction. So destruction is all about kind of, in the previous, the consummation, you get the sense of riches. With that kind of sense of riches and that sense of an empire, you always have throughout history someone eager to take that over and destroy it. So this is depicting, rape, destruction, pain, suffering. The decadence that they experienced made them a target for other societies or other civilizations and made them a threat for them. It's kind of the human nature of greed and sexuality. And in terms of atmosphere, the change, this is very kind of clear. It's midday. This is kind of the same. But then you get to destruction and it's tumultuous. It looks like a tempest is taking over the entire city. Moving on, we have desolation. So going back to Thomas Cole's idea of the blasted landscape and pushing against industrialization, now we see the ruins kind of retaken by nature. We have vines creeping up the Roman columns, the Corinthian column. We have birds nesting at the top. We have, it's hard to see, but there's a deer right here wading into the water. The wildlife has returned. And the destruction of all of this kind of civilization, or industrialization, if you will, is now giving way to nature reclaiming its space. And once again, we have this rock here, symbolizing that this is the same space repeated throughout this entire series. So, all together. This is how they were displayed as a series. And notice kind of the time of day, the sense of time that he uses. It's very subtle. That the Savage state is kind of early morning, sunrise. And then we go to the Arcadian state, where it's kind of late morning. Then we come to the consummation, where the sun is high in the sky. Bright sunlight bathes them in their decadence. And then we go on to a late evening sun with this storm. And then kind of the moon is coming up in the sky, and this is dusk. So that sense of the cycle of a day repeating itself is also very important to understanding this work in terms of the cycle that he views society to take. Industry and war, and then reclamation of the earth, and then the cycle repeats itself. So definitely an important one to know. Also, Thomas Cole, good to know, is was kind of the forerunner of the Hudson River Valley painters, who were all about kind of this blasted landscape, and it was about depicting the natural landscape in the most sublime, natural kind of way. But yeah, moving on. We've already talked a little bit about this, but this is the most essential aspect of deconstructing the art that you come across, is content versus context. So you start with content. Describe what you're seeing. What is the medium? What are the subjective, psychological, or sensory aspects of what work that you see or gain from it? What is the emotional or intellectual response or message that the work has? Does it depict political unrest? Do you get the sense that there's a death of a lover? Oppression, existentialism, war, religious fervor? These are all aspects of content. So what is the purpose of the work, do you think? Does it ask any questions? Is it meant to challenge the viewer, and what is the takeaway? So is it meant to challenge, and what is the takeaway might come after you learn a little bit about context, which is the conditions in which the work of art was created. Who is the artist? Where are they from? Do they have a personal or cultural history that is relevant to understanding the work? What time period was the art produced? Are there any art styles or trends that inform the work, either contemporary or historic? Artists generally always reference the art that came before them. New art movements are always a kind of push against the one that came before it. So usually it's just as important to understanding that movement or that piece of work to know the history. Or are there important social factors happening at the time that the work was produced that inform the work? Economic, religious, political, racial, etc. Right now there is a lot of Islamic art being created that is a direct reference to the wars in Iraq and the war on terror and the kind of destabilization of Middle Eastern countries that they're experiencing. So that is all so important to understanding the work that they're making now. So, going down for content and context, this is going to be a painting that kind of shows up more and more in this class. It's Theodore Géricault, The Raft of Medusa. It's an oil on canvas French painting in kind of the height of Romanticism. Now, Romanticism dealt with expression of intense emotion, especially negative or uncomfortable emotions, and it typically dealt with subjects involving nature and the sublime, as we discussed earlier. It was really served as a break from the constrictive and emotionless styles of the past, such as neoclassical Renaissance art, which came before it. So a little context on The Raft of Medusa was on July 2nd, 1816, there was a French ship called La Méduse, or Medusa. It hit a reef off of the coast of Africa and was stranded. The captain and other officers escaped on lifeboats, but the remaining crew, comprised of about 150 people, had to escape on this makeshift raft. This captain of the Medusa was appointed as a result of political ties to the French monarchy, even though he hadn't sailed in years and wasn't really qualified to captain this boat. His political kind of friends made him the captain of this boat. So these people, these kind of refugees, if you will, were at sea for 12 days, during which they endured fights, mutiny, starvation, and dehydration, and survived by practicing cannibalism. Only 15 of these 150 people survived by chance when they spotted a ship on the horizon. And that moment that they spotted the ship is the moment that this painting depicts. You notice far in the back on the horizon, there's a little dot on the horizon. That is that ship that ended up rescuing them, called the Argus. The painting has a composition. So we're talking about composition, is how the figures or objects or subject is arranged within the painting. So it's a pyramidal kind of structure that both sets of people are kind of in a pyramid form. And that's just a compositional kind of thing to add emphasis to these tips. You kind of have the idea that this up here becomes a kind of cross or crucifix, and that's at the apex of that pyramid. Whereas on this side, the apex of this pyramid is that person flagging down the Argus and the gaze of these people. So when we talk about gaze in art, especially painting, it's very important. Because you follow, as the viewer, you naturally follow the eyes of the people in the painting. So these people down here, they are staring up. You kind of enter the painting down here from this person that goes off the edge. You kind of go in, and then you follow this arm up, and their gaze up. So the point of focus is really right here, and then we notice that they're looking back at the Argus. So it's depicting that moment that they spotted this ship. So this painting is massive. It's like 14 by 16 feet or something like that. I don't know the exact. Actually, no. It is 16 feet by 24 feet. I apologize. So it's massive. This painting, going along with the emotional aspect of it, it's meant to include you in the scene. It's so large that it's almost like an IMAX theater. You have this kind of figure spilling out into the edge of the frame, almost coming into your space. So the sense that the artist wants you to experience the emotion and the craziness of what is going on in this painting as if you were there. And that was really what Romanticism was all about, is that emotion, that intense feeling. Now, going on from there, I want to talk about this one here. So, like I said before, with content versus context, understanding the time in which a piece was made and the climate around what was going on at that time is incredibly important. And understanding art history, because artists often reference art from the past to make their points. Now, this is Banksy. Many of you know him as kind of the renegade graffiti artist. Take a minute and think about kind of what he is depicting here and what his reference to the Raft of Medusa adds to it. All right. So, as with most Banksy works, it's very, very political. Graffiti is already a counterculture and subversive medium, in that it's illegal and it's done in public without permissions or without any of this, and it's punishable by the law. And it's meant to be seen by the masses rather than the art world elite and intellectuals. So the idea of appropriating or referencing the raft of Medusa in this painting is incredibly important. It recontextualizes it without changing it significantly. It's really about the Syrian refugee crisis. This was done on a wall in Calais, France, which is incredibly important because it recalls a local history to criticize current events. So Calais was home to the Calais Jungle, which was the name of a refugee camp that was evacuated by the French government in October of 2016. Calais has been home to such encampments since 1999, and ever since the French authorities have been evicting, detaining, and displacing these populations of refugees. The jungles are kind of squalid and lack basic resources, irrigation, and facilities to be sanitary, hospitable places to live. So they're really kind of awful places to live. The refugees face terrible conditions when leaving their countries just to make it to these places, much like the crew on Jericho's Raft of Medusa. They risk their lives to brave the seas in hope of a safer life or to be saved. The Argus in the Raft of Medusa, which is the ship that saved them, is replaced by a luxury cruise ship or yacht that sails in the opposite direction of the refugees. So that kind of attitude, that kind of nonchalance about the issue of the refugee crisis by Western cultures is what Banksy is kind of pointing his finger at. So thinking about these, and for next class, I want you to fill out one of the compare and contrast sheets in your workbook, comparing and contrasting these. Now, when you do that, I want you to think both about content, what is there, what you understand without the context, and context. I want you to describe what you're seeing, and then compare them. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And what did Banksy do in appropriating this imagery to recontextualize it in the kind of modern lens of the refugee crisis? I believe, yes, so this was assigned last class, the describing art, so that should be done by next class as well as the art around us assignment in the workbook. If you have any questions, please email me. Any questions about the content that I put in this video or about the homework, and you might get one more video to try to catch up some more. But for now, that is all. Enjoy the rest of your week.